here. Now this week we are jumping back into Joshua, and we'll start in Joshua 12. We have a long section, but it's a very boring section this week. As I try to describe it to the teachers, I guess not in prep class, but those who have come up to me outside of prep class, we're trying to describe a map without using an actual map. And so we're using words to describe something that could very easily be an image, a graphic, something that you can draw and we can see. So we will be spending some time in doing that. But for about a month, we have been studying the book of Ruth. And before we move on, and I know this is dangerous so early in the class, but I'm going to open it up. What are some closing thoughts on Ruth before we jump back into Joshua? If you don't have any, that's fine. We can just move on and start droning on about this map. But if not, I wanted to offer some time, if you didn't get a chance over the past couple weeks, what were some of those final things that you just really wanted to bring up out of the book of Ruth? Tempe?
I appreciate it because Ruth was not a Jew, and she was, it was hard at first when she and Naomi got there, but later she was accepted, and the lineage that she provided for Jesus. So it's just another example of how the Lord uses different nationalities in the lineage of Jesus. It wasn't just Jews.
Yeah.
I guess mine was the same thing, Bergan. Just to step back and just go back through that story again and just thank God. Just thank God for what He does, and then also to kind of look at our lives, my life too, and just thank God for how He's worked in my life.
Good.
And Ruth being lovable and kind and understanding and loving her mother-in-law and staying by her, and thinking then, they must have not had too much, but they coped with it, they stayed together, and being family, it meant a lot. And I thought, that kindness and goodness of a person doing to somebody else is so neat. And I think that's the way God wants us to love each other, and really care for each other. And her faithfulness was really a treat to me.
Sure.
I think it could have been her faithfulness, not knowing what she's going into, not knowing what was going to happen. Even though she had the choice to go back to her homeland, she could still gone back to her homeland after she got there. She could have said, this is just not for me, I just can't handle this. We don't really know what she went through. It had to be hard work. She was in another land she probably didn't know very much about other than what was told to her. And putting her faith in a God that she didn't know, those are hard things to do when you're being in the military, we've traveled to different places. And I hadn't felt real comfortable in some of those places. I know we went to the Philippines, we went to Japan. Everything was written in Japanese. I'm thinking, I don't know how to read this. I don't know what's going on. But I can understand some of what she must have experienced a little bit. I haven't had nearly as tough as she has, but yeah, that's different.
Sure. And you guys all highlighted some good points coming out of Ruth. Now, jumping back into Joshua, we probably need to remind ourselves what has happened so far in the book of Joshua. We saw early on the crossing of the Jordan. The Israelites cross over from Moab through the riverbed on dry ground, and they have come to set up their military camp at Gilgal. From there, they had military success against Jericho. most of us were familiar with the story of, well, we march around the city for 7 days, and on the seventh day we do it 7 times, and then we blow a ram's horn, and then the walls come tumbling down. Because, well, that's the children's story, right? Well, yes, there is a children's story that kind of goes like that, or goes like that. It doesn't kind of go like that, but we did spend some time highlighting, no, the command is not just, and then the walls fell down and everything was good. No, then you have to go march through and actually conquer Jericho. You have to do as the Lord has commanded you. And then we saw the 2 sieges of Ai. The one that was unsuccessful because they thought, we can handle this. We don't need to do the same thing we did with Jericho, where we asked God for guidance. We kind of know what we already need to do. And Ai is not that bustling metropolis that Jericho was. Not that Jericho was a bustling metropolis. In comparison, Lubbock would have been a bustling metropolis to them. But we even know we're not even the biggest city in Texas. I'm pretty sure the DFW Metroplex has us well beat at that. But then we saw how Achan was called out because of his because he had stolen from Jericho, and how they failed at the first siege, not only because they didn't trust in God, but because God was fulfilling His promise that if you take stuff from Jericho, if you steal what has been devoted to destruction, you will carry the curse of destruction on you. But eventually Joshua makes right, makes good with God, and they're successful at conquering the city of Ai. And then the next week we kind of talked about how the Gibeonites deceived the Israelites by saying, "Oh, we're from way out. We're way down the street. We're not close at all. We're not from Idalou. You don't have to worry about us. We're from well past Snyder. No, you're right down the road. We should have been more cautious. We should have listened to God." But because of this alliance, whether it was by deception or not, they were deceived into siding with the Gibeonites, and then 5 Amorite kings emerge, and they are ready to say, well, we have to stop this alliance now. And then we kind of got a list of how Joshua would carry out the conquest against the northern cities and the southern cities, and we kind of got a decent picture. Now this week, none of this information's super interesting unless you just really love lists and history and genealogies and maps. Some of us do enjoy that, but I understand not all of us understand it, so I will try and keep it engaging as best I can. I guess this is a good time to bring up the map. This is the land of Canaan. We can kind of start to see some characteristics that are still there today. Specifically, where is it? The Sea of Galilee in the north. Well, we know someone walks on water up there, and then there's the Jordan River, and well, we know someone is baptized in the Jordan, and the Dead Sea. Well, we've heard stories of what happens at the Dead Sea, and so this is the land of Israel for all of time. This is where they're coming into, and where chapter 12 begins is we get a retelling even before Joshua 1. We go even further back. We are in Numbers, and it is the conquest under Moses. And it describes 2 kings, Shihon, the king of the Amorites, which we see he's defeated in Numbers 21, verses 21 through 26, and King Og, king of Bashan. And really, that's just kind of a footnote. We don't necessarily need to remember a lot of this information. Some will say, well, this Og that's mentioned here is somehow related to the Og that's mentioned in Ezekiel, and I have to sit there and say, I don't know. Og may have been a more common name than we're thinking. But especially because Og of Magog doesn't seem to describe this portion of the land of Canaan. But, ooh, my voice is giving up already. Chapter 12 continues, and it gives us a description of how much land under Joshua they have now conquered. Crossing over from Moab, they have now conquered these cities in the north and these cities in the south. And it lists 31 kings that Joshua has defeated. Some of them actually get names, and some of them it's just the king of this city. And I can quickly run them down for you. Might as well. It starts off the king of Jericho. Well, we saw him get defeated when, of course, Joshua conquers Jericho. The king of Ai, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, the king of Gezer, the king of Debir, the king of Geder, the king of Hormah, the king of Arad, the king of Libnah, the king of Abdullam, the king of Makkedah, the king of Bethel, the king of Tappuah, the king of Hepher, the king of Aphek, the king of Lashron, the king of Madon, the king of Hazor, the king of Shimron, Marion, the king of Ashaphath, the king of Tanakh, the king of Megiddo, the king of Kadesh, the king of Jokneam, the king of Dor, the king of Goim, and the king of Tirzah. Now, not all of those kings show up, I guess, in a spot that we've covered so far. A lot are covered in those first 10 chapters, though, and some aren't referenced at all in the story of Joshua or the conquest. A few, like the king of Bethel, won't appear until Judges 1. Well, why is that? Well, Judges 1 starts at a time before the end of Joshua 24. Joshua dies at the end of Joshua, but Joshua also dies at the end of Joshua 1. Not Joshua 1, Judges 1. And so there's this time of overlap in which there are still conquests being carried out. However, we can argue and debate all we want. Really what's happening here is the conquest is continuing, and the main idea that we are left with is by the end of chapter 1, we have conquered this other chunk of land, and you can kind of already see where some of this portion in the south, it has been left unclaimed. But we know these aren't the borders of Israel. We know Judah will eventually reach down into the southern bits of the desert. But now we are... but this is all we are given at the end of Joshua chapter 12. And so we have this land in the north too, because Joshua, you are to go up and conquer the land of Lebanon as well, but that never happens, at least not in this account of Joshua, and it doesn't happen in Judges 1 before Joshua dies either. And so the idea is left to this. The tribes of Israel are each supposed to go up and conquer the remaining portions of their land. Now, there's bits and pieces that they are still supposed to conquer. Specifically, these areas are highlighted in chapter 13. Because what happens in chapter 13 is God comes to Joshua and says, Joshua, you are no longer the fighting man you once were. Even a couple years ago, maybe you could have done this. But what has happened is you have become old, and I can tell you're tired. You're not going to be the one to say, yeah, you're right, God. Or you're not going to... I'm messing up my whole example. Joshua is not the kind of person who says, God, I'm tired, I'm ready to retire, I'm going to quit. Instead, God has to be the one to say, Joshua, you're tired, it's time for you to retire, it's time for you to quit. But don't worry, I have other leaders in line. I have a plan for what's going to happen. Instead of putting it all on you, I'm going to put it on the tribes. The tribes are responsible for themselves. And so go ahead and divide the land. Not only what we have already conquered, but what is left to conquer. So not only these blue and yellow and green portions, but especially that red portion. Tell the tribes of Israel exactly what they are supposed to do. And so on the not the left and the right, that's not the cardinal directions. On the east side of the river, that green and yellow portions, that's already been divided amongst I really should know this. Gad, half the tribe of Manasseh, and good thing I have the book right in front of me.
That's why you have it.
The Reubenites, the tribe of Reuben. And so what we're getting is, again, those tribes will be dismissed to go home at the end of our section for this week. But then we get this portion that is very lengthy of describing exactly how the other 9 1/2 tribes are supposed to get their land allotted. And the initial bit looks something like this. So Manasseh is at first the largest one. Just because I'm blanking on the reason. It's not even in Joshua. It's in, where is it, Deuteronomy? It's because of the lineage from Joseph. Manasseh is the firstborn of Joseph and is the one who has received the blessing from Jacob in Egypt in Genesis, and it's promised to them again in Deuteronomy. And that's it was a big dividing point for the tribe of Manasseh. Why are we supposed to also? We don't want to inherit anything on the east side of the Jordan because we're supposed to be inheriting something on the west side. We have been promised this land on the west side of the Jordan. And so when they have this division, there was some frustration there, but the promise was it's not one or the other. It's this portion in the east and this portion in the west. And we continue. And what we get is some tribes are rewarded greatly. They get large portions of land because they are stronger. They're bigger in population. And others are not as large because they're not as big as of tribes. And we get and at first, all of the southern territory is promised to Judah until God tells Joshua, you gave Judah too big of a portion. Go and send the tribe of Simeon out amongst the tribe of Judah. Go send them out amongst the tribe of Judah, and they will live mostly around Beersheba. But go send them out because they need to be the ones to cultivate the land because Judah cannot do this all by themselves. Now, it is interesting, just from a more modern perspective, they're sent out to cultivate this land. Well, most of the land Judah and Simeon are taking over is desert. Go cultivate the desert, you two. Wait a minute. Cultivate the desert. Even if we were to go up further north, that you're still close to the Dead Sea. Well, the Dead Sea gets its name because there is no life around the sea because it's all salt water. God, what do you mean cultivate this land? Well, if you're looking at maybe the basins and the valleys, you're right. But the mountains in this desert are actually quite plentiful. You have to learn to develop step farming where you cut into the sides of the mountains and level them out into basically giant steps. And in that soil, in that dirt, you will find that this is plentiful land. It's land in which you can grow grains and all your produce year-round. It is a land flowing of milk and honey. But then again, there are also territories that aren't conquered properly, I guess is a way of putting it. They're not conquered the right way. Most the biggest example is the tribe of Dan. Now, Dan has a portion at this allotment right here, but they're supposed to be taking this strip belonging to the Philistines. And you may see some names, and it may look like some current locations. This is the Gaza Strip. Dan, you need to go in and conquer the land of the Philistines, drive them out before you, and you will have peace on the land of Israel. You are to be a great tribe along the coast. Well, they fail at that. They don't fail in the time of Joshua. They kind of kick the can down the road. We'll worry about that later. We need to worry about rebuilding the city of Jaffa. We need to focus on this. We need to focus on that. There's so many other things we need to do before we even think about conquering the Philistines. So much so that when it comes to time and all the other tribes are like, all right, we've done most of the conquering. We're ready to start settling this land. Has everyone done their part? And they say, everyone's looking at Dan and saying, well, the Philistines are still around. The Philistines haven't been conquered. What happens is the tribe of Judah, because it is the strongest at the time, will come and sweep across the seaplain from the mountains in the east, and they'll sweep down to the west, up to the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and they will conquer this Gaza Strip, as we will call it nowadays. But you weren't supposed to do that, Judah. That wasn't what you were supposed to do. That was what Dan was supposed to do. And as we look ahead, and we see Dan will be destroyed, and the Philistines will reemerge, and the tribe of Judah will be pushed back out multiple times before the king of Saul shows up, but especially in the narrative of King Saul, because, well, who is David fighting? Well, when David, the little boy, comes out or not little boy, probably teenage boy, comes out and fights the Goliath, he is going up against the champion of the Philistines. And the Philistines were threatening all the other tribes and were about to destroy the people. This isn't a great map. There are some errors on this, but it does show that Judah expanded out to the sea. In trying to put together these slides, you may have noticed the first couple looks like someone hand drew over the overlays. That's because I hand drew the overlays because I couldn't find one that was showing what I needed. And even now, you don't find great maps because, well, it's all just words in our Bibles for the most part. And you always get the debates of, well, was that river really named this? I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't the one to name it. I'm just going off of what you named it. Why are you second guessing me? But I bring up that story of Dan because the tribe of Dan will not hold that red portion forever. If anything, they are the first tribe to lose their inherited land. If we go back, they're promised this sliver around Jaffa. And even when Judah comes across, they even lose more of that land because the Philistines had pushed them back. Well, it gets so bad that they lose their entire territory. And the tribe of Dan says, surely, my brothers, you will not let us die out here without our own city, without any land. And the other 11 get together and say, you know what, you're right. We won't let you die. So what we came up with is you get to move all the way to the north, and you get to be on the front lines against the Hittites. If the Hittites ever come up to march against us, you will be the first city to know. So you exchanged being on the front lines against the Philistines to the front lines against the Hittites. It's almost as bad as being on the front lines against the Moabites. Those three nations always came up against the tribes of Israel, the nation of Israel, or the nation of Judah. They never get rid of those threats. And so Dan goes from a promised portion, and that's well described in these chapters, and it turns into a singular city. I don't want to necessarily just read off all of what's here, because a lot of it's really hard to pronounce names. I've already pronounced enough hard names today, and it only gets worse. But what we see is that these locations, these names, these places aren't just names to be just kind of thrown away. Though we are kind of speeding through it, where we are taking it probably with less reverence than some might like. But what we see is these names, these places, these tribes will continue to keep showing up, especially throughout the whole Old Testament. These enemies that you were to drive out before you, you tribes of Israel, you have to drive them out. Well, why do we have to drive them out? Why do we have to do exactly as you say, God? Well, you may not see it, but give a couple years and they'll be back. These evil, wicked things have been labeled evil and wicked by me, and I want you to not do them, because if you don't go to the extremes that I am telling you to do, those things will come back up again. Now, Dan, I am telling you, you need to drive out the Philistines. Why? Why do we need to do it? They are so much stronger. They have giants on their side, God. Do you already doubt that God would be on your side against a battle with giants? Do you already have doubts about what God can or won't do, or not won't, will do on your side? Have you already forgotten how you got into this position in the first place? You have forgotten why you even have territory in the promised land. Now, we can kind of apply this to our lives too. There's those evil, wicked things that God commands us, don't do this. Instead, I want you to live your lives like this. Well, why are you telling us this, God? No, well, why, God? You're just wanting to be a buzzkill. You don't know anything. I'm going to do my own thing. The things God's telling us to avoid, to go up against, there's a reason why. It's because those are the things that are harmful to us, not only physically, but also mentally and spiritually.
So we're dealing with Philistines today over there.
Yeah.
And if they had done their job back then, they wouldn't be there, would they?
That is how some have come to interpret this whole Israel-Palestine debate of, well, the only reason why there's people called Palestinians is because that's what the Romans called the Philistines. And so we follow the chain back. It's the same debate of it's Israel versus the Philistines. It's Israel versus the Palestinians or the Palestinians. Now, that is kind of too quick to ignore all the other powers that have risen and fallen in that area that have possibly changed, or not possibly, that have changed what the demographic looks like. There were several more empires between this time, or empires, kingdoms, however you want to describe it, that controlled that strip of land, that intermarried, that, sure, heritage-wise, we could say, yes, they are Philistines because they claim to have the heritage of Palestinians, and Palestinians going all the way back have heritage with the Philistines. But then we have to say, well, they also intermarried with not only the Romans, they also intermarried with the Egyptians and the Ottomans and the Arabs, and like we get down, it's a whole lot muddier of a situation to say it's as black and white as, well, Israel's good because the Bible says they're good, and the Philistines are bad because or the Palestinians are bad because they're Philistines. And we can debate all we want about right and wrong and good and bad in our modern context. But again, it's that idea of what God is commanding these people to do has a reason behind it. There's a purpose in all of that. And that brings us to the end of chapter 21. So all of that summarizes about, 9 or 10 chapters of the Bible. Without having to pronounce all those very fun names that appear. But then we get to chapter 22. And what happens in chapter 22 is you have the Gadites and the Reubenites and half of the tribe of Manasseh. They're ready to go home. They've had their land conquered for a while. They were the first ones to have conquered land. Moses was with them still while they had the land. So not only have we seen Moses die and Joshua rise to power, we've also seen Joshua get to near the end of his life. And now it's finally time, all these fighting men, it's time for us to go home. Well, they don't know what home is going to look like. But what they intend to do is to build an altar. As a marker, as a monument. What happens in Joshua, well, we've already highlighted quite a bit of what they like to do is they like to set up stones, they have markers, altars, however you want to describe it as, so that when future generations would come along, they could say, hey, what's that pile of rocks represent? Well, that pile of rocks represents when we crossed the Jordan. And over here is, hey, why did we set up something here? Well, that is set up there so that we can remember. And so that I can teach you about what it means to be tied to these other tribes. Because we brought up modern quite a bit in that last little section about the Philistines, the Palestinians, and all that. Well, look at it now. There is no eastern portion of Israel. There is nothing on the eastern side of the Jordan. Where did those tribes go? Well, they disappeared pretty quickly once you become a kingdom. Because, well, then the armies of Syria would come down, and the armies of Assyria would come down, and the tribes of Babylon would slowly make raiding parties and then go away. And these tribes would slowly start to fizzle away. And then, of course, when the Assyrians destroy the northern kingdom, some flee to the south into Judah, but most of them are taken away. And no one's, when they come back, is saying, we need to reclaim all 12 territories. No, they say, we need to reclaim specifically Jerusalem first. Let us set up Judea so that we can have at least Jerusalem, and then we get the whole history, and we get to the Romans. Nothing's on that eastern side. But what was intended for these Easterners there's a monument reminding them of, don't forget about us on the east. Now they do. The West does forget about the east pretty quick. It doesn't take long. But the east was built this altar and came to the idea of let not only the eastern tribes never forget, but we better hope that the West never forgets what the east has done for them. We could have sat behind and said, no, you're good, go conquer it on your own. But they didn't. They said, you are my brothers, and so I will fight for you so you may have land. So you get the gifts that I have been given. And we can think of how this story shapes our way of thinking about loyalty and obedience to God's commandments. But what happens is after the East has built this altar, people in the West start to hear about it. And they jump to a completely different conclusion than what the East was set this altar up for. Instead, it reaches one of the priests, and the priest starts to lose it. He's like, how dare they set up an altar? This is the worst thing ever. We need to rally the troops. We need to destroy them because they have become heretics. Because what they're saying is, they didn't build this altar to God. They didn't build this as a monument. They're building this to some idol. We just got the land. Why are you building to an idol? Why have you already forsaken us? What a low view of your own brother. To say, yes, I know you've been loyal to us. You have been with us, fighting with us all these years. And we know you're obedient to God's commandments. But since I'm not with you, holding your hand and making sure you're doing right, anything you're doing must be wrong. Whoa, that's not the tribes that you just fought a war with. And so there's miscommunication and there's frustration. The West believes that the East is acting out of malice because they're thinking if they built an altar to some foreign god, we are to be destroyed. God has said, if you build an altar in this land to an idol, I will punish you for it. So they're thinking if they built an altar on the west side, they're not going to get punished over on the east. The punishment's going to be poured out against the west. And you have to sit there and think, what God are you thinking of? Did not God punish those who he specifically knew did something wrong? Did not Achan get singled out amongst all of the tribes and all of the clans and all of the families and all of the households? And God said, this is the one who did wrong. So why would it be any different? Why would he think, oh, you built this altar on the west side, so it must be someone on the west side built the altar? That doesn't make any sense. Have you already forgotten what has happened in your own lifetime before your very eyes? And the East has to remind them, we did not build this as a witness to some other god or some other power. We built this as a monument so that you could never forget us. You will never forget what we have done for you. Because this is a reminder of who God is and what God has done as well. God led us into this land. God has blessed us. God has made those who are loyal to him flourish. How quick are you to forget that? You need this monument more than we do, you Western tribes. You have forgotten already. We haven't even left the West. We are still waiting on the bridge to be built, or however they got back over to the East. They're still waiting for God to maybe hold up the waters on one end again so that they could walk on dry grounds back to the East. Or they're waiting on their little boat to carry them all across. None of them have made it back to their homelands, and you have already forgotten us? Because we are no longer camping right next to you? We're no longer neighbors? In the sense of we are right next door? How quick are you to forget what God has done in your life? And that's where we're going to leave this week. Because next week we will start in Joshua chapter 23. And we'll get back down to just one chapter a week, at least for these next 2 weeks. Yeah, and then we'll jump into Genesis, and we'll talk about the summer probably more next week as well. But Joshua has to rally all the tribes back together, even those eastern ones who just got back home. Come back. We have to get back together because we have to recommit ourselves before God. Why? Because you have already forgotten what God has done in your lifetime before your very eyes. I thank you guys.
Thank you.
Oh,
Hope your voice gets better.
I hope so too.
It sounded like that they were trying to do something for the future children to remember. But there were also times when there actually were idols that were
Sure.
built. So how does that, so they were looking at it as wrong by doing that? By building an altar because they were actually thanking God for what he had done, he had seen them through? Or was it really, I'm not sure I understand what it is. Is good or bad? Or is it?
The East intended it for good. The West interpreted it as something bad. What they were getting was just, so these Eastern tribes have built some sort of altar on the Western land. Well, the term altar could jump, we could even in our modern context jump to several different things. What do we mean when we say the altar? We have, in churches we have the altar call. Well, we don't have an altar, but we have the altar call where everyone goes up front and sits on those first rows. Well, those first rows aren't the altar. You jump into, say, a Catholic church, the altar is their communion table. That's the altar. And when you jump into the Jewish context, well, their altar is more of, it's kind of similar to what the Catholics have as their communion table, but it's more...
Is it for an area that's supposed to be speaking to God?
Yes. But in the Old Testament context, you built altars to Yahweh, God, yes, but you could also build an altar to Baal or Molech or any of these other not gods who are idols, and you may not have you may not have built something out of silver or bronze or made some statue or graven image for this other god, but you could have dedicated it to him. And so the West is, what they're initially hearing is, so the East has built an altar on Western land. Well, an altar to who? Well, I don't know. Well, if you don't know, it's probably not God. So we need to go take care of it. They've done something wrong. But instead of learning all the facts, they're just sitting there and saying, well, we have to destroy them. They've already sinned so quickly. But the East is saying, no, we're not the ones who have forgotten. You have been the ones to forget. And so, does that clarify?